نحن صوت الكادحين من جذور الأرض جبنا من صميم الآلم بالضحايا ما بخلنا بالعطاء الأكرم
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another live stream. Hopefully coming to you this time on free platforms rather than just one. And it's a busy one tonight. Got a lot of things to get through. And first of all, I'm just going to do the evening roll call of those of you who are in the chat. So, good evening to Irish Partisan, our comrade out there in Minsk. Good evening to Paul McCord over there on Merseyside. Good evening to Zuleika down there in London, I believe, and Banana Bender, who says good morning from the other end of the world. And we've also got Roddy, a good evening to you. And Paul McCord says, tomorrow 2 p.m. in Liverpool's a march in support of Palestine. Meeting at the bombed out church, marching to Derby Square. So if you're in the area, be sure to get along to that one. Irish Partisan says, Slavyangrad reports tonight that Russian troops have entered Avdiivka. That's a bad one for a certain former comedian and current, or soon to be former president of Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky. And good evening to Kenneth out there in Norway, and Rob. Good evening to you. PM, good evening to you. Now, I'm just going to drop the necessary advertising in the various different social media platforms because I've been trying to get Odyssey to function, and it finally is, so I want to make the most of it. So I'm just going to do the relevant advertising here. If you have questions you want me to look at, be sure to drop them in the chat and we'll take a look at those as we go on, and we will proceed with a discussion of the latest from, of course, well, the lead story being Palestine today and what's been going on, but also the various protests all over the world. And I'm going to be taking a look at those. If you've attended one today, be sure to drop your experience into the chat group. Always good to hear from different demonstrations. So we'll begin with the latest out of Palestine yesterday, of course, or I should say more accurately, occupied Palestine, was that the much-awaited Israeli ground offensive had begun, and various apocalyptic scenes were played out on various social media networks that you see these things on. Of course, you don't see the majority of this on BBC or ITN or Sky. You may see a little of it on Channel 4, but still very, very much edited. You see a little bit more of it on on Telegram, and of course Al Jazeera covers it, which is why Tony Blinken was telling them to tone it down. But the various apocalyptic scenes, as I said, that were playing out yesterday following a heavy aerial bombardment and sea bombardment of Gaza, were followed by what appeared to be, in the end, quite a limited ground incursion, where the Israelis went in and then appeared to retreat again, which was the pattern that they'd followed on two previous occasions. One when they'd come in by sea and had been heavily fired upon by the Palestinian armed forces and had retreated, and that notorious story that's looking like it was very much true when the American special forces and the Israelis went in and became trapped under heavy fire and had to be extricated from it. And I saw some photos floating around again. These are Palestinian sources, so some of this may be propaganda, some of it may not be, but they report to have captured some of the weapons that the US forces had on them. So certainly something happened. As to what, the Americans are still not talking about it. And the US is still not being fully honest, clearly, about all their casualties, and I'll come to why that might be in just a moment. There is also a report that was out today about the way in which the Israelis apparently have constructed a mock city ruin in some army training base somewhere, where American officers are trying to instill some kind of practical knowledge of urban warfare into the various units of the Israeli army. This was accompanied with various photos to demonstrate this. And this has been hastily put together under the command, apparently, of American officers. There are apparently American officers running most of this operation now. This isn't being discussed out in the open because, of course, if and when it all goes wrong, the Americans will walk away and go, that Netanyahu, he wouldn't listen. So be prepared for them to shift all the blame onto him, having taken command of this operation themselves. And, of course, it's positive in some senses that the Americans have come out from behind the curtain and shown who's really running this operation, because it removes the illusion of Israel as an independent nation. And that's something that we very much need to dispel. And we very much need to dispel it for a number of reasons. First of all, the idea that the Israelis are doing all this stuff on their own needs to be dispelled. They are only able to do what they do because they have, until now, the most powerful nation in the world fully behind them. Before that, of course, way back in the past, the Zionist movement had the British Empire behind it for quite a long time. So this is a movement followed by the creation of a state that is wholly dependent upon the imperialist powers for its supposed independence. And without that, it doesn't exist. Without the Americans stepping in over the last couple of weeks, there's a good chance the whole thing would have fallen apart completely. So let's go into a little bit why that I think that is, because it was picked up in a comment that followed a live stream I did recently when I said that the reason why the Americans are rushing all these aircraft carrier groups down there is more to do with propping up the Israeli state than it is with actually any real plan that they have to use all this air power that they have on these aircraft carriers in some kind of war against Hezbollah or Iran or both. Though that is, of course, a possibility given the rather unstable nature of some of the people in the White House. All of this is much more about propping up the Israeli state, which is why you've got all of the vassal states in Europe moving their increasingly pitiful military hardware into the Eastern Mediterranean. It's all about making sure that the Israeli state is propped up. Now, to understand this, I will need to go back and repeat a couple of things that I have dwelt on since this latest round of the, a 75-year crisis for the Palestinians has begun in the last, 3 weeks now, since October the 7th. So what is going on here is a frantic attempt by the US imperialists to save their colony, their colonial project in the Middle East. And of course, without, as I said, without that backing, there is no Israel. But why do the American imperialists continue to back it up, is the question. And to get the answer to this, we, of course, go back to the original purpose of why the British Empire backed the Zionist movement, and that was done specifically so that a essentially British-created militaristic statelet would exist in the Middle East, to which the sole purpose of it is disruption. The sole purpose of Israel is to disrupt the development of what were soon to be the independent Arab states, to make sure that they were always either at war with Israel, or at risk of a war with Israel, or at risk of Israel making war on them, and of course perpetually having to look over their shoulders in case they came under attack from Israel. The whole purpose of it is to make sure that the Arab world, and we go back here to the word of the original governor of British Mandate Palestine, a guy called Ronald Storrs, is confronted with this military outpost of imperial power. And the way in which that this is done was modelled upon the Ulster model. And for those of you who are familiar with it, the Ulster model was created basically to make sure that not only did Britain keep a military footprint in Ireland, it essentially then was used, this sort of garrison statelet in the north, the occupied 6 counties of Ireland, was used to distort the entire development of the supposedly independent Irish state, originally called the Irish Free State. Many Irish Republicans still refer to it as the Irish Free State. And so Israel plays the same role. It's a completely militarized society. It's completely dedicated to making sure that that region remains unstable. And it plays this role in various different ways. First, there's direct war. That's the most obvious one. And we can see that has taken place on numerous occasions over the last 75 years. Then there's the other way in which it aids imperialism, in which its existence and the fact that it is this militarized state conveys this threat to its neighbors, which encourages the growth of internal conflict inside those countries, which there was going to be internal conflict anyway, but it encourages the growth of comprador elements, and the comprador elements are encouraged to sign deals with this thing, which creates further dissension inside these countries. And of course, the most potentially powerful Arab nation being probably Egypt in terms of population, in terms of economic potential, which is of course being squandered by the comprador regimes that have ruled Egypt since the end of the Nasserist period and the treachery of Saddam. It's to encourage the growth of comprador regimes. It's to keep the nationalist regimes under siege. It's to do all of these things to encourage the growth, of course, of the civil war in a place like Lebanon. Interestingly enough, Ehud Olmert, the former Prime Minister of Israel, said an interesting thing. It was an interview that's been circulating online recently. You may have seen it. He's being interviewed a number of years ago. He's saying that Assad's biggest mistake was not to make peace with us in 2008. If he'd have done that, he would have avoided the Syrian civil war. Meaning, basically, that US imperialism, having failed to completely subordinate the Ba'athist government in Damascus, then unleashed a civil war on it, with Israel acting very much as one of the local agents for that war, providing active assistance to the various jihadist forces in that war. Various jihadist forces, which, by the way, including ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria, haven't said a word about the situation in Gaza, haven't issued any statements, haven't declared eternal jihad on Israel, as far as I can see. If you know differently, put it in the comments. So this is the role that Israel plays. So we return to the question then, why is the US so desperate to save it? Well, I've just answered that in the previous question. by to bring this up to date, by pursuing the normalization agenda with the Arab states. Well, first of all, you're doing that principally to try and bring the Arab states into an alliance with the Israeli colonial state in order that you can then push the Arab states into hostile actions against Iran. That's what the normalization process that Trump pursued and Biden has pursued. It's about essentially using, again, projecting power through the Israeli colonial system and Israeli colonial state and building an alliance around it that will principally be targeted at Iran. That was what that was all about. Now, the actions, I would argue, of the Palestinian armed forces on October the 7th and since then have managed to kill that stone dead. So that's undeniably one of the achievements of the Palestinian armed forces so far, which is that normalization process has been thrown back. And the comprador regimes and the Arab reactionaries are on the back foot at the moment due to the rage of the masses, both towards Israel, the US imperialists, who a lot of these characters are still in bed with, for all the fact that places like Egypt and the Saudis have wavered in their alliances, so in their allegiance to a fading US imperialism. They're still very much tied to US imperialism to this day. Now, whether that changes over the course of this crisis is another question. But so this is why they're piling in there, trying to preserve Israel. Because if Israel was to implode or go down in some way or another, then the biggest lever that the US has to pull inside the Middle East is gone. Its biggest source of potentially creating problems and conflict and its biggest potential forward operating base, all of that goes if Israel goes down. And that's why Biden has moved these aircraft carrier groups down there. It's why Blinken ran over there. It's why all the different European leaders went over there promising all kinds of things that they probably can't deliver upon. It's why they're all sending armed forces down there to one degree or another. It's an attempt to preserve this military outpost / colony, which if they lose, then the position of the what I will call the Euro-American imperial bloc, that position is very much diminished. That's why they're so desperate to save it. That's why they're sending all those forces down there. It's an attempt to intimidate, of course, Hezbollah and behind them ultimately Syria and Iran, but also it's desperation. And I'll outline a little bit more about what I regard that desperation being about. In the first 2 days after the successful Palestinian armed forces raid into occupied Palestine proper, you got a situation of like panic and paralysis in Israel, where the IDF was running around like a headless chicken, where the government was wobbling and discredited, where nobody knew what was happening. And is it a risk that Israeli society could have imploded then? In my view, there is a distinct risk that it could have done. Bear in mind, this isn't a very secure society anyway. The only thing that the Israeli political leadership can unite to any degree the population around is aggression against the Palestinians. And that's about all. Without the colonizing project on the West Bank, without the actions of the wild and crazy settlers, there isn't a lot there to unite them. You saw that earlier in the year when they were at each other's throats over Netanyahu's so-called judicial reforms, in reality an attempt to establish a dictatorship or a move more to an openly Bonapartist form of government, even within the confines of so-called Israeli democracy. And that, of course, comes from years and years of political instability that have flowed from the decline and fall of the old duopoly, the Labour-Likud duopoly, who'd swapped power over and over again between the 70s and the early 2000s, the breakaway by Ariel Sharon to form Kadima, that falling apart, or falling into becoming discredited. Netanyahu was the only real constant in Israeli politics, which is why he keeps coming back. He being an incredibly corrupt scumbag who everybody knows is incredibly corrupt, and of course the growth in the Kahanist fascism as well. All of that contributes to an extremely difficult internal situation. And if Netanyahu was suddenly discredited and exposed, which he has been, and his coalition partners revealed as not only, of course, corrupt and murderous, but also supremely incompetent and useless, then the Israeli state itself was wobbling. And again, that's why they all rushed down there to shore it up. And it's why they're still, to this moment, allowing it to go on a bloody rampage against the Gaza Strip. And this is why things are where they are. But of course they are constrained. They're constrained by the fact that the Israeli army doesn't seem to be good enough to go into Gaza and be able to actually prevail. They may be able to in the end, but at such an enormous cost that it would further destabilize Israeli society. And also because, of course, you have Hezbollah in the north, and beyond them you also have, as I mentioned before, an apparent Syrian underground that's been reported upon by people like Elijah Manier in the occupied Golan Heights, and ultimately the role of Iran itself, which is far stronger now than it was 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, despite, or perhaps because of, the sanctions forcing a high level of innovation inside the Iranian economy. So this is the background as to why things are unstable in Israel, why Netanyahu is apparently getting advised by the same people who designed Zelensky's wardrobe. He's going around dressed in black as if he's trying to do some strange impersonation of like a bad lounge singer or something. I think he's trying to look as if he's in mourning, but he just looks weird. It's shaky for him, and he knows it. And the American imperialists know it too, but they also know that the longer this goes on, as I've said on multiple occasions before, the more unstable the regimes that other American alliances have depended upon in the region become. So there's been a lot of play made of Erdogan making various different comments, but again, I remain wholly unconvinced that this ridiculous opportunist, this man who has collaborated with US imperialism and Israel for 25 years, is now somehow transformed into an inspired new version of Saladin or something, who's going to lead a jihad. He's not. He's a cheap reactionary whose rule in Turkey has been described by anybody who has observed it as like a uniquely awful time, even by the standards of Turkish rulers, and those aren't good, by the way. A man who has, of course, dramatically increased trade with Israel every year for the past 20 years, where there is extensive assets deployed by the US military, including nuclear weapons. So Erdogan, of course, makes a big speech in Parliament, makes a big speech in front of a huge rally out in Istanbul. But of course, it's, I blame Israel, I blame the West, down the West, and all that kind of thing. It's waffle. It's waffle. It's designed to convince his electoral base, which is more anti-Israel and is potentially more anti-US. It's designed to convince them that he's doing something. In reality, he's desperately hoping that Netanyahu calls an end to this so he can go back to business as normal, because there's no way that the Turkish bourgeois wants some kind of confrontation ultimately with US imperialism. They don't. I mean, people who think that the Erdogan's about to pull the sword out and start, leading the jihad. I mean, these people have read too many Tom Clancy novels. Don't look at, what the man says in sort of flamboyant asides in speeches. Look at the capital flows between the trade relationship between Turkey and Israel. Look at the trade relationships that Turkey has built. Look at where the Turkish debt is held. Look at the Turkish enmeshment in NATO, which still goes on, despite again all of Erdogan's words about our Swedish Quran burners. He's still going to approve ultimately Sweden's entry into NATO. He's not leaving NATO. And that is all, of course, part of the desires of the Turkish capitalist class. It's the same reason why Erdogan would still, I think, favour some kind of closer relationship with the EU if the EU would have Turkey. They won't, by the way. So, again, this is a nonsense. But the fact that he's having to say all these things points to the fact that he is under pressure due to the barbarity of what the Israelis have been up to. So to turn to the question of what is the purpose here in terms of potential war with Iran, I don't think that this is what the US imperialists have in mind. Some of them do. Some of the wilder elements in Washington think that they're going to get this. But my point is they can't possibly fight that war, because they don't have the men on the ground to do it. They're not going to get a victory against Iran by launching all these air assets from their aircraft carriers. That's not going to work because, first of all, the Iranians have the capability of shooting back and potentially sinking a lot of these things if they were to do that. Secondly, there is this distinct risk of the Iranians closing the Strait of Hormuz and disrupting the global oil trade, causing the recession that we all know is coming based on the various points of instability inside the US system, the chaotic derivatives market, etc., and also the ability to disrupt the liquefied natural gas trade. So those two things count against it. But let's, again, take a step further back. You also need, if you're going to try and operate an air war in the Middle East, the Iranians have the very, very decent ability to hit a lot of the U.S. air bases in the Middle East, as well and the naval bases, and as well as, of course, the aircraft carriers. Take a step further back and examine, even if the US was to summon up the manpower to be able to go into Iran. Iran's a huge country with very, very impressive natural defenses in terms of mountain ranges. It really ground up Saddam Hussein's army over 35 years ago. And the Americans simply don't have the men or the kind of equipment now, according to not my judgment, but the judgment of American military observers, to actually pull this off. Go back, even take a wider angle view further and look at, they would need then to do this, to try and take some kind of military action to wage a war on Iran, would take a massive expansion of the American industrial base, which simply is not going to happen in this shorter period of time. They can't do it because they run out of ammunition. They'd run out of bombs for their aircraft, assuming they can still launch their aircraft. They would be stuck very, very quickly. Bear in mind that even back in 2003, when they invaded Iraq, when they still had more of a comprehensive industrial base that could resupply them, that was still very close in terms of them running out of supplies for their army. I mean, that was still, that if it wasn't for the fact that they were going against a country that had been destroyed, or extremely badly damaged by years of war and sanctions, they would have had much more trouble with that. Going up against Iran, which has had many, many years to plan for this and design their defense doctrine around planning just for this, when the US's military industrial base has withered, when everything it produces is not produced for efficiency, it's produced in a production process which is designed to create as much profit as possible at every stage of the process. So they can't do it, is my point. They can't industrially do it. And that's why they chose to, and to go back to Ukraine, that's why they chose to make Ukraine into a proxy force and build it up to use it against the Russians, because they couldn't fight with their own men in that way. And also, and you've got to bear in mind the willingness of people in the US and Britain, for that matter, to actually sign up to the armed forces. Very, very poor recruitment rates. In fact, it's been a poor recruitment rate inside the United States, even taking into account the slight upsurge you got after September the 11th. It tailed off very, very quickly, and that's after a direct attack on the US homeland. Britain, it's the same thing. I mean, admittedly, the politicians here have cut the ground army down to the bare minimum. You can now fit it inside a football stadium. And according to even British generals, the most you can get out of it is about 20-odd thousand men who would be ready to actually go and fight. So, and that's why, of course, the plan for Taiwan, if we believe what's been said so far, is to build up Taiwan to the point where they lure the Chinese into an invasion, and then they hope to use the Japanese as the fighting force against the Chinese, because that's ended well in the past. They plan to do this without deploying too many of their own men. So they can't go and fight Iran now. They can't. They would lose badly. So all of this is posturing to make sure that the Israeli colony survives. That is my opinion on the subject. Right, I see that we've got a number of comments here in the discussion group here. I will scroll up to the top. Where are we? Good evening to Steve Sweeney, who joins us. Be sure to listen to the interview I recorded with Steve fairly recently. It's on the podcast account. Lord Charfield, good evening to you. HM, hello to you down in Brighton. All right, Steve's got some comments on the demonstrations, so let's jump into that, shall we? Steve says, I know I'm jumping the gun, but I came away from the demo today. I assume you're talking about the London demo, Steve. Feeling utterly demoralised. It was encouraging to see many people on the streets, but the speeches were awful and nobody put forward any serious demands. Yes, we know how bad things are. Yes, we demand a ceasefire, but victory... But surely we should be raising the slogan victory to the resistance and offering our support to ensure it happens. Trade union speakers gave the usual grandstanding speeches, yet not one proposed strike action to bring the Israeli war machine to a halt. It was the same speakers you see on any platform at any demo. Well, yeah, that's true. I would say I took a slightly different view to you on this, Steve. Yeah, I was unsurprised because it's the same people who've been organising Palestine solidarity demonstrations in Manchester for decades, and the same speeches that are long on emoting and short on a program. But I mean, we've got to expect that, to be honest. I mean, they're not going to raise those demands about victory to the resistance, because the people who organise these demonstrations, as I'm sure you know as well as I do, these are all either Labour Party, not Labour, well, maybe Labour Party, but trade union bureaucrats sometimes, though the trade unions in Manchester stayed away from this largely. They didn't seem to want much to do with it. Or people who were like ex-trade unionists, soft left types, sort of Labour aristocracy types, the kind that ran Stop the War into the ground 20 years ago and have never done anything since. I mean, in my view, the positive thing on the Manchester end, I can't talk about the London end because I wasn't there, was that I've done these things. I've been to these things in Manchester, started going to them 13 years ago when I first moved back to the city. And back then, it was all mainly like the same crowd of blokes that you would see. Now you've got a much younger end getting into it. And a lot of those people were actually keen to hear about, or at least read about, the position that we were there putting forward, the CPGBML position. I think there's great potential in a lot of those people for to actually hear about the real demands that should be raised. Because Steve's right, which is that none of the speakers at the Manchester rally, unless I missed something, raised much of a plan. It was all just we got to do this. Though to be fair, one of them did link it to the campaign against Elbit, the company that supplies arms to Israel. So that was at least something concrete. But mostly it's just ceasefire now and we stand in solidarity. Again, to be expected. I would say that our approach to it is the positive approach to it that we can take is to just try and get our material to as many as people as possible, try and talk to as many people as possible, and try and promote the slogans and a program that Steve's talking about there. I wouldn't say that we should look to the platform at all for anything other than just the usual gibberish. And of course, the risk is that these people march a load of people up to the top of the hill and leave them there. They don't even march them down again. But that's the way we've got to orient ourselves around this. We have to be prepared to tell people, look, these people on the platform, some of them might mean well, others of them have been doing this for years and basically leading everybody down a blind alley, and that's why we need a different approach. And you could tell that the authorities are, in Manchester terms, again, like if you're in London, feel free to correct me, the authorities here are quite comfortable with the way in which the demonstrations are being conducted at the moment, and the speeches all stayed on the respectable side. I mean, if any of us had got the chance to go up there, we'd have probably been kicked off, but raising the slogan of victory to the Palestinian armed struggle, raising the slogan of about the Zionist state and U.S. imperialism must be defeated and driven out of the region. Those things, I think, would have been popular with the crowd. I think the crowd would have gone for that, other than like the nervous-looking soft leftists who organised it. But again, it's like a case of the platform speakers and the organisers always want to keep this on a, what they regard as the safe territory. And the safe territory is like them doing their sort of bargain basement Gandhi act. Yeah. So yeah, at this stage, unfortunately, this is who dominates these things, and we've just got to get to as many people as possible, I think, and draw them into a more positive program of action. Difficult thing to do, but it's a mark of again, the fact that the institutional left still dominates a lot of these areas and remain useless. I mean, I'm doing an analysis at the moment of like the various leaflets that were put forward by like the different trot groups and the different campaign groups that were there, and it all amounts basically to sort of really bland slogans and no real explanation of the role of imperialism, no real explanation as to what Israel actually is. It's just like, this is bad, something should be done. But I'll be back with more on that tomorrow night. Another Cape colony like South Africa, says Banana Bender. Well, there is a lot of similarity there. Israel and apartheid South Africa are always very much interlinked, and I think there was a good deal of collaboration with the old nuclear program that the apartheid regime had as well between them and the Israeli state. Philbin says, seeing the protests and outright civil disobedience spread here in the States is genuinely inspiring. Jewish Voice for Peace were among 1,000 who shut down Grand Central Terminal in New York last night. Yeah, there were value in actions like that, I would say. I mean, in the United States especially, the fact that you do get a lot of left-wing Jews going out and being prepared to be arrested, that's undoubtedly a good thing. Basically showing up the Zionists that they don't own Judaism, and it's certainly building up the contradictions inside the United States. It's certainly yanking the chain of the reactionaries. So that's on the positive side of things. I don't want to dismiss these mobilizations as just wholly negative. I don't think anybody wants to do that, but we always have to bear in mind that a lot of the organisers, particularly in Britain, are people who are just very good at driving things into a ditch. Roddy says, that's what I fear too, Steve, with reference to the previous comment. As I saw an earlier post of yours, it's interesting hearing Many on the marches being much more politically advanced than those on the stages. That's often the case. I mean, I think, to reiterate the point, I think the crowd in Manchester today were ready for people to go up there and say victory to the Palestinian national liberation struggle, and explain why the Israeli regime had to be defeated and why it had to fall and why the two-state solution is a lie. I think a lot of people in that crowd were ready to hear that and might already believe it themselves. As the great Chairman Mao said, to paraphrase slightly, always trust in the creativity of the masses. The masses might know instinctively all these things already and might have a much more advanced understanding than some idiot trade union leader who's going to go up there and go, oh, this is bad, we should do something. And then won't mention the fact that he's planning to tell you to vote for the Labour Party next year, which they all are, by the way. Rob says, at least one speaker at the Manchester demo spoke about taking further action, but was not able to elaborate on how or for what purpose, beyond protesting outside certain businesses. Yeah. That's the impression I always get. I mean, as I said, I've seen a lot of these in Manchester. It's like protest, and you're demoralised. So it needs to go somewhere. At the very least, it needs to be building a better understanding of the situation. It needs to be spreading a better understanding of the situation. And also as to why protests are allowed that will burn themselves out and go nowhere. It's why, ultimately, I think that the British cops aren't wading in and arresting loads of people. They are harassing individuals. It's because that they know very well the character of the people organising these things. And they know very well that these people are always in pursuit of respectability, bourgeois respectability, and won't take many risks. They won't go out there with a radical message. They won't say victory to the national liberation struggle, or this is what we should do to impact upon the war machine in Britain. They won't do any of those things. And the more sensible end of the British state knows that. The rabid bits of the Tory party and the Labour Party are too stupid to know that. That's why the permanent bureaucracy is a much more dangerous opponent. Putin's shirt says Turkey is also full of US bases. That's very true. Philbin says, I've seen great slogans from Irish demos online. Right to resist, right to return, awesome stuff, comrades. I agree, not enough willing to defend Gaza resistance. Yeah, I mean, that has to be done unapologetically. And I think, again, plenty of people on the march today, I got the impression, were more than prepared to do that. There weren't many there that I could see. There's probably a few who would, I mean, all the trot groups would go pale if asked, do you support Hamas or something by a tin pot reactionary or a provocateur. There would be, some of them would go pale and run away. I think most of the crowd there, though, would support the principle of the necessity of an armed national liberation struggle. I think that the number of people there pursuing what I would call like a sort of milk and water Church of England position was very, very few. Those were the organisers. Right, where are we now? Putin's shirt says again, in Sochi, Putin told Erdogan to shape up so he can get into BRICS. Well, then there's got to be a resolution of the conflict within the Turkish ruling class, because part of it probably is looking more eastward, but another part of it also has a lot of interests in looking west, looking to the EU, looking to the US. And the alliance with US imperialism been embedded for a very long time. I know there's people talk about, oh, Erdogan's purged the military of NATO supporters. No, I don't think so. I mean, Erdogan has been an absolutely integral part of what is essentially a NATO or US imperialist-run war on Syria that's gone on for a decade. So he's very well integrated in NATO. Don't mistake the puppet show on that he puts on for anything real. Not at this stage. Burke, good evening to you. Martin, good evening to you. And good evening to CJ out there in Richmond, Virginia. Putin's shirt says it's not about winning a war, it's about the empire destabilizing, where are we? The region again to prevent China and Russian influence going. Well, if that's the game, then they've failed and they've been checkmated. Like the only way, actually, I'll continue with Putin's shirt's comments. But the US is on a losing path. They won't push Russian and Chinese influence out of the Middle East. They won't be able to divide the Muslim world so easily again. And now that it's more united than ever. No wonder China brought Iran and Saudis together in their recent rapprochement. Looking at Russian and Chinese geopolitics over the past decade, it's almost like they knew the US was going to gun for the Middle East. Well, the US identified the Middle East as the key strategic point 30 years ago. That and, of course, breaking up Russia, which, again, was early on a point of the Wolfowitz doctrine. The issue in the Middle East, of course, is that one of the issues is that the need to push the US out is one that, of course, the Iranian government agrees with. The Saudis, of course, are still trying to play both sides of it. Quite where they land is going to be interesting. The UAE, of course, was signing deals with Israel in the Trump years. They've been kind of forced back a little bit now. So before this process can be completed, I think it's still the case that the various reactionaries will need to be thrown out of power. I think that what this process has revealed, what the October the 7th military, or so we call it a special military operation, has revealed, is that the king of Jordan, the Saudi reactionaries, the Egyptian regime, all of these, and Erdogan himself, in fact, all of these have been pushed so far into like verbal types of opposition, and of course including the PLA Comprador regime. But at the same time, they're still playing their role in the region for U.S. imperialism. Like the Jordanian monarchy is still acting as a military ally of U.S. imperialism. Even though it's talking about ceasefires and voting for them at the UN, it's not breaking alliance with U.S. imperialism, which it's had for many years now. The Egyptian reactionaries, the al-Sisi government, might have defied the US over the US's attempt to carry out a mass ethnic cleansing in Gaza, not because that al-Sisi is particularly a friend of the Palestinian struggle, but because he's afraid of an internal revolt if he did agree to that. He's still trying to ride two horses here in terms of moving into the BRICS system, but also trying to retain the alliance with U.S. imperialism. And of course, Egypt continues to honor the Camp David agreement signed by Sadat and Begin over 40 years ago. So again, as the PFLP pointed out as early as 1968, 69, the Arab reactionaries, despite their verbal opposition to Israel now, are still the knife in the back of the Palestinian struggle. And BRICS or no BRICS, until either one of two things happen. Either they are forced to actually act in solidarity with the Palestinians, which actually brings them into direct conflict one way or another with US imperialism, or they're thrown out and shoved out of the way and somebody else comes in who will. And until then the struggles of the people in those countries are going to be always thwarted and betrayed, because these are weak comprador regimes which were put in place in some cases by British imperialism in the case of the Jordanians, or thrown into power by a combination of a coup orchestrated partly by the US and partly by the Saudis when we look at, of course, the case of al-Sisi. So again, the question that the PFLP raised all the way back in the 60s still applies. Until these regimes either are forced to act to enforce their own sovereignty and independence, which they're not fully sovereign and independent countries right now, or they're thrown aside and replaced by people who will, then this struggle is always going to be partial. So, CJ, in Richmond, they closed the march with a flop. Write your congressman. Would that be the congressmen who are 100% behind Israel, and by the way, behind the NATO war against Russia? But this is the nature of like the people who organize these things. It sounds like they're just as bad in the US. We need more Malamas. Very true. You have a month to remove the Israeli products, or we will do it for you. See, that's the kind of slogan people would get behind that, I'm sure, in the US. If people got up and actually started pushing for it. Maybe that's a potential demand to put forward. Martin says, leftist analysis, bad things are bad. Very true. Philbin says, agree we should build labour guilds, spread class consciousness during this too, but avoid opportunism as well, linking imperialism with Gaza bombardment to Marxist-Leninist thought, no problem. Yeah, very true. CJ says, that is precisely why the demo fell flat. The organisers were telling the masses. I mean, the organisers, I think it's a little bit worse than that. It sounds like to me the organisers are trying to limit the masses. So if you, if you organise like a mass demonstration outside some of the major supermarkets, for instance, if you want to turn boycott, divestment and sanctions into something real, just like they've stopped putting made in Israel on products, apparently. That's one thing that's been said to me recently. But there is like a barcode which identifies where it's from, and I'm pretty sure you could find where some of this stuff's from. Like, send the supermarkets an ultimatum. Say, unless you remove all these products with this barcode on it, that comes from Israel, then we'll get people in there to run in and do it for you. Now, that's something you couldn't just do off the bat because you would face arrest. You would need to build up to that. And you would need to build up a support network for any comrades involved in such an action. But it would be a demand to put forward, to talk to people about, to make people think about this like boycott thing in a way and carry it out in a way that would actually cost the supermarkets money. That would be a conversation to have with workers as well in the supermarkets about where the products come from. Again, engaging workers in the struggle, actually spreading it out beyond polite protests and letters to your fucking MP or congressman, that's the way to take it, which of course the organisers never will. And so essentially what we've got to do is make these demands ourselves, organise our own meetings, take the impetus away from the pathetic reformists, and in our country like the pathetic reformists linked to the Labour Party. The role of Starmer, though, I would say, I hope Keir Starmer remains leader of the Labour Party and keeps backing Israel no matter what, because he's been of great help to us so far. Lachlan says, the captured Israelis' families are fighting with rabid Zionists over their families not getting help by the State of Israel. Yeah, the Palestinian armed forces offered to release all the civilians without condition, I believe. They're keeping the military prisoners. And essentially the Israelis turned them down, which is creating all kinds of trouble inside Israel now. Because, of course, the families are saying, well, why aren't you taking the offer? Netanyahu and his goons under pressure from a different angle are saying, well, not saying anything. They're just continuing with the bombing campaign, again, which is creating more and more problems. Philbin says, documentary on West Bank, security wall tomorrow at Red Ink Library, Providence, Rhode Island, supposed to be National DC demo on November the 4th. Okay, interesting. Putin's shirt says, Mohammed bin Salman sent Lindsey Graham home with the message, don't get involved in the Israeli conflict or else. Well, it's interesting with what role the Saudis will play here. I mean, the idea that Lindsey Graham is going to play hardball with Mohammed bin Salman is a bit of a joke. Lindsey Graham's not exactly a threatening figure. And if he tried to threaten Mohammed bin Salman, I imagine that the MBS laughed at him. I mean, the Saudis could make life very difficult for the Americans if they chose to do so. The question is, are they going to do it? I mean, they could start dumping some of those dollar bonds that they've got onto the open market. They could, of course, further impose either an oil embargo or cut production to raise the prices on the international market, pushing the U.S. economy towards the brink. All of these things they could do, and much more, of course, pull some economic levers to cause pain to the U.S. economy. It'll be interesting to see if MBS is prepared to do any of that. And of course, it's not just him. He sits in, of course, a relationship with various different forces inside the Saudi ruling clique. And does he have enough support in that to come out and openly defy the United States? Interesting. If he does, then, of course, that shows that to a certain degree, the Saudi ruling clique has evolved to a certain point where it can now act more independently, which will be an interesting thing because, of course, the kingdom is very much the joint creation of US and British imperialism in alliance with MBS's grandfather, I believe, Ibn Saud. And if it's moved to the point where the Saudi ruling clique is confident enough to basically tell a declining US empire to fuck off, then that is a genuine move towards some greater degree of national independence and sovereignty, a form of revolution from above carried out by an autocratic ruler, but still a significant one. So we await to see the consequences of this. How is it the case that with all this potential chaos awaiting them, that the US is prepared to tell Netanyahu that this now has to stop? Or is it the case that they are too divided amongst themselves, that there is a sort of militantly pro-Israel faction within the US regime, which of course includes the entirety of the Senate and most of the Congress? But, of course, there are divisions to be exploited within the US population. There is consistent polling which shows the enthusiasm for Israel exists in powerful electoral minorities, but I would argue that most of the US working class is probably open to the arguments that people like us will be putting forward. Right. CJ says, to be clear, Malema was calling for the kind of action at supermarkets. Well, a demand we should probably pick up. This is from Philbin, any waves made in the UK at deployment of 2 Royal Navy ships recently, joining the French as well. Missile frigate and aircraft carrier for them. I think they're helicopter carriers from in the big NATO flotilla. Yeah, well, frankly, I'd be surprised if any of those naval vessels that they've sent over there could even launch an aircraft. They've had that many technical problems with them. And besides, it's all like pathetic waving of a shriveled dick, basically. Again, like what the hell is this force going to do? Like wage war on Hezbollah and Iran from the Eastern Mediterranean? I mean, the other interesting threat that was apparently made today is that Hezbollah can destroy the gas infrastructure that the Israeli state has in the Eastern Mediterranean, trying to steal gas that it's not entitled to as well. So again, that's another move that could be made here. A lot of these carriers are now in range of anti-ship missiles that Hezbollah has. Apparently the long range, according to Scott Ritter, this is long range Chinese air defense system can cover Iran, which of course is what the Chinese premier was Li Keqiang was talking about the other day when he was made the comment that China was committed to ensuring the security, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Iran. So again, like the US is stuck in all of these angles. If these lunatics in Washington wanted to try and launch some kind of attack on Iran under the pretext of this, then they've got another thing coming. So it all comes back down to, and this is the point I want to conclude on, it all comes back down to production in the end. The US does not have enough productive capacity to wage a successful war itself. Therefore, it needs to play games, and it needs to try and find proxy forces that will do the fighting for it, like Banderist Ukraine, like Israel, like Taiwan, or like Japan. Because the situation inside the United States itself is that the US can wage limited and of course very destructive air campaigns, but anything more serious than that calls into question the effectiveness of the US industrial base, which is very much diminished. And if you go beyond that, what capacity does the US have to raise an army these days? It's a serious question. What capacity does what loyalty does the US state actually command, even if you take into account all the hysterical propaganda that they will engage in, all of the attempts to sort of whip up national chauvinism into a frenzy that the entire political and media and intellectual structure of the US bourgeois will engage in if they did come to that. But how much capacity to raise an army do they have? Could they even equip it if they did? All of these things I think the US will be found wanting in. And ultimately, their bluff, I think, will be called throughout this. And eventually, the Zionist reactionaries, the fascist regime in Tel Aviv, is going to have to back down. And it will have to back down because it will not be able to do the ground invasion without incurring the hit back from Hezbollah, who will be as good as their promise, I think. And everybody knows this. And of course, as Putin's shirt comments in the discussion forum, then if the Americans insist on enabling the Israelis to pursue this, then their own bases are gone. Then their remaining presence in Syria and Iraq gets wiped out. Then they might be subjected to attacks in their other bases in the region as well. So they might lose everything to try and preserve the Israeli colonial state. Was that worth it? They might end up with, again, depending upon what the balance of forces is inside Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman and his friends destabilizing the world economy, which the US can ill afford given how fragile its own economy is. Forget whatever Janet fucking Yellen says. She's just a paid propagandist. The US and British and French and German economies and Italian economies are all on fucking life support, limping along, barely growing, completely stagnant, parasitic economies that could easily be pitched into crisis by a rise in the price of oil, by the further destabilization of the dollar. This is a very vulnerable system. That, of course, means that it's still dangerous, but it's also one that's very, very weak. It's held in place by inertia, as I keep saying. It's held in place by inertia internally because the sufficient proletarian forces have not developed yet to be able to pose a real challenge to it. And so as a consequence of which you get these completely rotted bourgeois political structures hovering above society, unable to actually move forward and unable to actually provide any solutions to the problems, the multiplying problems that US and British imperialism and French imperialism face. You throw in also for French imperialism that the West Africans are slowly kicking them out. So the whole thing here is an escalating crisis over which the US imperialists only have limited control, and that's becoming more obvious. Yuan chimes in with MBS and the all the Arab compradors' first priority is to make sure Israel doesn't lose to the Arab revolutionary voice. History is a witness to Saudi Arabia's dedication to this cause. Yes, very true. Which is why I think ultimately the moving forward for the region will depend upon the removal of the reactionary regime in Riyadh as well. But We'll get into that. That's another story. The Palestinian revolutionaries are smart enough to know, and know from long experience, that the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia are, at best, very unreliable, will always look after their own interests, as is, by the way, certain elements of the Palestinian bourgeois themselves, the ones who stand behind Abbas, whose PLA forces are still arresting people on behalf of Israel in the West Bank. Again, Israel's occupation of the West Bank only works to the degree that it does with the active collaboration of the Abbas regime. So it's kind of a joke when you see the Palestinian, the PLA representatives on the media. These people's regime is an active collaborator with Israel most of the time, but they're called on as like supposedly legitimate representatives of the Palestinian population, but they work for Netanyahu. They work for U.S. imperialism. They have to go on and give these speeches now about the real crimes that Israel is committing, but they've been collaborating with them for 2 decades or more. What will be the legacy of Janet No Inflation Yellen, asks Putin's shirt. She'll be a footnote in a very long book about the decline and fall of U.S. imperialism that maybe one of us will write. The book will begin in 1945 and will probably conclude in 2030. And Janet Yellen will be one name amongst many that will be featured there. The legacy of somebody like Alan Greenspan is far more important than the legacy of Janet Yellen. But again, this is a matter of decline that is baked into the cake that is U.S. imperialism, that is British imperialism. Like, the way in which these economies developed was forecast by Marx and Engels back in the 1850s and 60s. It was further elaborated upon by Lenin in 1916. And there are, of course, other theorists who've followed along who've done valuable analysis, such as Samir Amin and others, looking at the imperialist global system. But you could see the fate of U.S. imperialism and British imperialism from Marx, Engels, and Lenin onwards. This was a matter of financialization, the move to imperialism, the decay and rotting away of the productive forces at home, the move to economies based on the moving around of capital, the export of capital, and of course the turning of the home nation into an endless economy based on shifting around of money and provision of services. And all of this is there in Lenin's work on imperialism. You could just stop there and understand the current system perfectly. Of course, you can add to it in various different ways, and I'll be expanding upon that in future episodes. But I'm going to leave it there for tonight. Thank you to everybody who has tuned in, and I'll be back with you again tomorrow. Be sure to watch the interview with Comrade Marius from the United States on the channel if you haven't done so already. But until then, I will thank everybody for tuning in and for contributing to what is, as always, a very interesting discussion in the chat group. And I will be back with you again tomorrow.